Hello, everyone. It's Sally here again in the Sky News Daily Studio. Today, we've been hearing from some of the families in Israel whose loved ones are missing, now assumed to be hostages in Gaza.
I want to tell her that we love her and we miss her and we want her back, but we want all of them back.
They're beating and they're screaming at him and they're cursing him, and this is my son in the car. What are you doing? And they're shooting.
My message to my daughter is that I love her so much and I miss her so much.
It's impossible to imagine what the hostages are going through. It's 10 days now since they were taken, and we know from the tactics used in the attack on the 7th of October that Hamas are capable of anything. Hostage-taking has long been a feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but nothing like this before. Back in 2011, the Israelis swapped more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners for just one Israeli soldier. This time, we're talking 199 people. But Palestinian civilians in Gaza are in a living hell too. 2,800 people have been killed and 11,000 injured since the Israelis responded to the attack by Hamas. There's intense diplomatic efforts to try and calm things down, to protect civilians, and to stop this war spilling into the wider region. And in the latest development, the US President Joe Biden is expected to fly to Israel on Wednesday. In a moment, I'll be speaking to a former hostage negotiator, Scott Walker. But first, let's have a chat with my colleague, Alistair Bunkall, who's our Middle East correspondent. Hi, Ali. Now, Antony Blinken has been holding meeting after meeting in countries in the region. But now the commander-in-chief is being called in. That is pretty unusual, isn't it? Presidential visits aren't usually thrown together in such a short amount of time.
It is, and I think it shows the urgency of the situation and the importance that the White House puts on it. Antony Blinken, as you say, has been in the region for a number of days now. He started in Tel Aviv and then went to Jordan, Bahrain, the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and Egypt before coming back here. Last night, he was meeting the Israeli President, Isaac Herzog. They met for 22 minutes, I'm told. And then he went back to the Kiryat, which is the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, which is where the War Cabinet, the Israeli War Cabinet, sits at a time of conflict. Now, that bit was unscheduled, and we knew something was up, and I was starting to hear rumours that it might be something to do with a visit by President Biden. And then a few hours later, in the early hours of the morning here in Israel, Secretary of State Blinken confirmed that. So President Biden will come here on Wednesday, and then after about 5 or 6 hours on the ground here, meeting all the key players, he will go to Amman, which is a short flight, 20-25 minutes east of here, and he will meet there Sisi from Egypt, King Abdullah of Jordan, and Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president.
As you say, Ali, Secretary of State Blinken was locked in hours of negotiations with Israel's war cabinet. What difference do you think the arrival of Joe Biden is expected to make?
So if you've had your chief diplomat, your Secretary of State, travelling around the region as Biden has, why does he need to come? Why are the Americans taking a risk, putting their president into what is effectively a conflict zone? Two obvious messages that he will deliver here is a message of solidarity to the Israeli people and, of course, a message of deterrence to Iran and its proxies. But is there something more behind his visit? Now, we know there are areas that they've been pushing on diplomatically. Hostage releases, the opening of humanitarian corridors to get vital supplies into Gaza, and also the opening of the Rafah crossing between Gaza and Egypt to allow some people out. Perhaps only dual nationals, but at least to allow some people to escape Gaza. So those will all be areas of discussion, and those will be areas that they want to make progress on. But is there even something more that Biden is here to try and get over the line? Is there a reason why the US president needs to be here? Is he the one who can perhaps get something done that Blinken can't? I honestly, it's an awful thing to say, but I think we're just going to have to wait and see.
And of course, Israel's not a big country, Ali, and there's always immense security when it comes to a presidential visit. So can we assume that this ground invasion that we've been expecting into Gaza by Israeli forces simply won't happen while Joe Biden's in the country?
I think that's a logical conclusion to come to. It'd be my assumption that the Americans have said to the Israelis, don't do this whilst he visits. And the reason being that a ground invasion has the potential to spark a wider reaction. We'd have to assume that upon the beginning of a ground invasion into Gaza, Hamas will start firing rockets again much more ferociously than they have been doing over the last few days. There is a potential for the West Bank to flare up, and there's a potential for things to escalate further on the northern border with Lebanon than they have done already over the last couple of days. And it has been very, very tense. There's been a lot of tit for tat on that border.
Is there a sense that Joe Biden may be coming in to attempt to try and de-escalate things? Of course, there's a huge amount of concern about civilians in Gaza, and even airstrikes now have hit the south of the Gaza Strip, despite this huge evacuation order that's been in place in the north.
The Americans, certainly in public, are fully behind Israel and its right to defend itself and Israel's objectives of eliminating Hamas. But make no mistake, the Americans, certainly behind the scenes, will be cautioning very strongly against the effect that this is having on the Palestinian population in Gaza. Both civilians dying as a result of the airstrikes, but also civilians who have now been put into dire circumstances because of the shortage of food, the shortage of water, the lack of electricity, etc. And so that will be something that Biden will have a conversation, no doubt, with the Israelis about, and Blinken will have already been doing so. We support you in public. We have your back. We've sent aircraft carriers here. But you need to make very sure that you do everything possible to limit civilian casualties. Not just on a human scale, I would add, but also the more civilian casualties happen, the more the figures go up of civilians killed, the more likely you're going to draw in other players into this conflict.
And of course, there's been a huge military buildup by the US in the region, Ali. A significant amount of military hardware has been pulled into the area by America. What does that tell you about perhaps the concern of this conflict spreading to the wider region?
Do they know something? Have they been given messages? Why is it that they decided so quickly to send an aircraft carrier group to the Eastern Mediterranean and then follow up with a second one? Why did they decide to keep some of their F-35 new generation fighter jets in the region? Of course, it is very much posturing. It is a message to Iran and its allies. Don't even think about it. Don't get involved. We are here. America is here, and we have Israel's back. But this time is so different to previous conflicts with Gaza. This time it feels different, and it feels like it could be much, much longer, and it definitely feels like it has the potential to escalate, and that is what the diplomacy is trying to prevent.
On a finer note, of course, there's American hostages also being held in Gaza, Ali, along with a number of other nationalities. How much do you think America will be trying to influence the hostage situation as well?
Very, very much so. They've sent teams of hostage negotiators and hostage rescue experts to help the Israelis out. They will be providing them with intelligence as well through the CIA, but also the intelligence platforms that they have in those strike carrier groups. So aerial surveillance, for example, anything they can do to try and help Israel locate those hostages, whether they're American, Israeli, or other nationalities. The Americans will be helping, as are the British as well in ways. Again, surveillance planes, but also there's an arm of GCHQ based out of Cyprus, which really is not very far away from here. It is effectively a Middle East listing post for the British. And so all of that will be coming into the game in order to try and locate them. But we don't know the status of the hostages, but I think what we can guess with some degree of certainty is that they will be spread out around Gaza. They won't all be in one place. And so therefore, when you're looking at 199, possibly more hostages, all in different locations in dense urban areas with a force like Hamas ready to fight to the death, any kind of hostage rescue operation is going to be extremely difficult and fraught with danger, both for the soldiers going in, but the hostages themselves. So I think negotiation is the preferred option, and at the front of that would be the release of women and children and the elderly.
And on a domestic note for Joe Biden, Ali, you know, the elections are next year. There's quite high political stakes for him here. He needs to be seen to achieve something, to bring something home with him. What realistically do you think he may be able to achieve, if anything?
Well, Joe Biden is a veteran foreign policy expert. This is an area where he has spent much of his political career focusing on, and it is an area where I think you could legitimately say stands him out from Donald Trump, assuming that Trump will be his challenger in next year's elections. As a slight side note, foreign policy matters don't tend to be front and centre of US presidential campaigns, but Biden, and we've already seen him in the Middle East trying to get the Israel-Saudi deal across the line, and we've seen how he's engaged in Ukraine and with China as well. Biden will want to reassert his foreign policy credentials and use that, no doubt, as part of his re-election campaign against Donald Trump. So if he is able to dampen down tensions here, if he's able to play a part in ensuring that this doesn't escalate, and if America is able to help negotiate the release of its hostages, of course, cynically, politically, that will be a good thing for Biden going into next year.
We're going to take a quick break here. More next on the hostage situation facing Israel. Scott Walker is a hostage negotiator. He's resolved hundreds of kidnappings, and he's the author of Order Out of Chaos. Scott's going to try and help us understand what might be going on behind the scenes in efforts to try and get these 199 Israeli hostages back.
Well, I think the first thing to say is that this really is an unprecedented hostage situation. Usually they may involve a couple of people, 1, 2, maybe 5 to 10 people, but we've got 200 people dispersed throughout what is effectively a war zone, an active war zone. So it really kind of heightens the stakes here. And usually the hostage takers will really want to look after the hostages because they'll want to bargain. They'll want to usually get a ransom paid out in return for the safe release of the hostages. And as we've seen already in this case in Gaza with the video yesterday, there is a proof of life. There are, to a certain degree, looking after the hostages there, but that still doesn't take away the stress and the unbelievable amounts of trauma that the families are going through right now.
The word unprecedented is being used time and time again when it comes to the events unfolding in the Middle East. 199 hostages, how does that compare to some of the other hostage situations that Israel's found itself in before? And of course, one of the ones I'm thinking of is Gilad Shalit, who was held for 5 years in Gaza, an Israeli soldier, and he was swapped for more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners.
Yeah, the Israelis have demonstrated that they don't like to leave people behind. They will go to, big lengths to get their people back, even if it takes a number of years. And on the face of it, quite a disproportionate agreement there.
Do you see a deal being struck, or do you think the time of negotiation for the Israelis is over and they'll attempt to rescue instead?
I think it's fair to say that all options are on the table. Yes, they will be looking at a hostage rescue attempt, but that is extremely high risk, fraught with many, many dangers. So normally a negotiated settlement is the safest and best way of getting people out. And so obviously they'll be looking at both options here. And clearly Hamas had some objective in taking the hostages in the first place. Yes, human shields is an obvious one. but it also lends itself to potentially some kind of prison exchange later on down the line.
Obviously, there's a huge amount of concern on a human level about how this number of people can be held, can be kept safe, can be cared for, especially when some of them are such young children. As someone who has an expertise in this field, what would be your main concerns right now?
Well, obviously the welfare of the hostages, and let's hope that if the hostages are kept together, not all 199, but in small groups perhaps, that some of the other hostages will be looking after the children, will be taking care of them and reassuring them as much as possible. And it kind of beggars belief that Hamas would not have considered, food and water and supplies needed to look after children and the elderly whilst holding them captive. Because to hold even just one hostage is quite resource intensive. To look after and hold captive and hidden away nearly 200, that requires a lot of planning and resources to do that for any length of time.
We heard from some family members who've got missing relatives at a press conference earlier. Do press conferences like that help?
From a family's perspective, what you want to do is keep in the minds of the public your loved one that's been taken hostage. And in certain circumstances, that might be beneficial across the board. However, when active negotiations are taking place, sometimes the last thing you want is this to come out in the media, because it can kind of get in the way of those negotiations, which could be at a very sensitive stage behind the scenes, particularly if third-party mediators are involved. And so usually we'd want to try and keep the media out of it in terms of the negotiations, although in this case, I can fully understand why the family would want to keep the profile of their loved ones front and center in the world's media.
Now, it's being reported there are more than 20 nationalities being held by Hamas in Gaza. Could it be that there's separate negotiations going on by different countries and that we could see hostages released at different times, if they're released at all, of course?
That's a really good point, actually. And conceivably, yes, that is potentially the case. But as we've seen in other high-profile terrorist kidnappings where different countries will negotiate the release of their citizens, whereas others aren't so successful. And so we'll just have to see how that pans out in the coming days, really.
Now, as I understand it from what I've read, Scott, you've never lost a hostage on any of the jobs that you've worked on, but it does feel that this instance is far more complex, far more unpredictable. How hopeful are you that one day at least these people will be released?
Hope is a key factor here. And what we've seen in history as well is that these things can take time. And what I always say to the families is there's no guarantees. We can't make any promises. This is a highly dangerous, fast-moving situation. But it's to be reassured that everything that can be done is being done behind the scenes, and that we must hold out hope that the loved ones will come back. And as we've seen again in the past, quite famous cases such as that as Terry Waite, where his family were told that he'd been killed, yet he came out a number of years later. And so having that mindset, staying positive, is absolutely key.
Okay, Scott Walker, certainly there's a lot we don't know, but we really appreciate your insight into this very murky world. Thanks very much indeed. That's it for this episode. You can scroll back through our feed for more on the situation in the Middle East, and we're staying across events for you here on the Sky News Daily. Back again tomorrow.
Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Sam Coates.
And we're inviting you to our homes every Sunday to give you the lowdown on what to expect in the political week ahead.
Westminster Politics is all about getting ahead of the game, so that's what we're going to try and bring you. An essential briefing packed with all the information you need to start the week.
From Politico and Sky News, this is Politics at Jack and Sam's, available every Sunday evening wherever you get your podcasts.